Everyone, my name is Kelsey and I'm with the Mansfield Center, which if you're not familiar is just down the hall. And we do programming classes in the field of ethics in public affairs and also relations with Asia and around the world. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eva Maria Maggi. And she is with the Department of Political Science here at UM and also the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. And Dr. Maggi teaches European politics and international security at UM and also at the University of Arizona. Her research on the European Union and the Middle East has been published in over a dozen peer-reviewed publications. Her book, The Will of Change, European Neighborhood Policy, Institutional Change, and Domestic Actors in Morocco, was nominated for the Best Dissertation Prize by the European Union Studies Association. Dr. Maggi, her current research examines the politics driving cybersecurity policies in the US and Europe and within transatlantic cooperation. She's contributed to NPR's Planet Money, the magazine Europe Today, and the Arizona Daily Star. I would also like to mention that the presentation is being recorded by the Missoula Community Access Television as part of the Media Assistance Grant donated to the Mansfield Center by MCAT. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all. Thanks for the wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I was just telling the Mansfield staff that I was supposed to give a similar talk to a different program for the Mansfield Center, and it was online on cybersecurity too, and the whole program, the access for the program broke down, so none of the external participants could actually take part of this, so I'm excited that I will be able to talk about cybersecurity today. And it's actually a very different talk that I'm giving than I was planning to do for the different part of the program. And this talk is particularly, as it says in the title, focused on the cyber hype, and I will talk a little bit about that, what that is. But before I get started, I have to do it, and I also like to do it when I have students, especially in Arizona, where I teach graduate classes on cybersecurity. We have a lot of active military students there that have security clearances, and I do base my research on publicly available material, but that is still classified. So if you have a security clearance, you have to be aware of that. I'm not showing any of that material, but you still have to be aware that that can impede your security clearance. So I like to say that. Give everybody a chance to leave the room if they have to. Great. So now to me a little bit. So yeah, I have a broad research background. I've been doing my PhD on Europe and the Middle East. And then wanted to change my topic and jumped on the cybersecurity train, and I'm very glad I did, because I think it's a very interesting topic. And what I will show you today is kind of where I am right now with my research. So it has been a great opportunity to really focus and go down and really put this where I'm in this work in progress, what I'm doing, basically in a 20 to 30 minute talk. So I will try to keep it at that, in that limit, and hopefully we'll have a lot of questions at the end. So I'm generally curious about the relationship between technology and public policy more in general, but particularly when it comes to security issues and the security issues within this relationship between technology and public policy. So it's a pretty broad research. And myself being a scholar of comparative politics and international relations, and being from Germany and living here for almost 12 years now, it's not very surprising that I like to compare countries and how they actually approach policy, and in this particular instance, cybersecurity policy. So I will focus a lot on the US cybersecurity policy today, but I also look at the European Union and different international organizations, so I'm happy to answer any questions when you have those at the end of the talk. Today I will focus on what I call, or we call in academia and also in the technology world, the cyber hype. So cyberspace is really increasingly seen as this kind of black hole that you can get constantly attacked out of. And that's not only we personally, but also states. And that's my interest in my research, is to focus on states. And while this increasing level of urgency when it comes to cyber threats is helpful to generate more interest in the topic and to get the public more interested in what is actually possible in cyberspace. So not only that it's great to get the freedoms of communicating with everybody around the world and reading and ordering different material, it's also an area that we can be threatened by and we have to prepare for. And it's important to heighten that understanding. So I'm not generally against talking about cyber, of course. I like to talk about cyber, but I do caution us to be too focused on the threats that come out of cyberspace and rather just to deal with them. So I will talk a little bit about how we actually came to this cyber hype. So how did we actually get to a place that we think about we're always overwhelmed by the threats that come out of cyberspace rather than just practically dealing with them. So let's see if we can get here. So when I talk in my classes about cybersecurity and how it kind of got started to be an international topic for states and the international level, I usually start with the Web War I, how we call it. And that really started during the Kosovo War in the Balkans in the 1990s when the NATO forces accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy. What happened afterwards is, when we look at it today, kind of a cute version of a cyber war, but it was still pretty effective. So we had a lot of denial of service attacks, which means you have a bunch of different clicks in a very short amount of time, and websites break down. You can't access them anymore. Coming from Chinese hackers attacking the White House, almost all federal agencies, shutting, I think, the White House website down for 3 days, which is kind of, whatever, not a big deal, but at the time it was. And but that was not only stuff there. There were also Dutch hackers that got involved, French, German. We had a whole different group of different hackers that are, for some were directly connected to governments, others were just independent groups that started defending NATO. It was kind of the idea of like, oh, NATO equals a Nazi regime here, like protests going on at the same time in China. So it was a big deal at the time because the Chinese government and public didn't believe that this bombing was accidental. So we call this Web War I because this is really the first instance that we've seen that that cyber attacks were used as part of a conventional warfare, and it kind of really spread around different countries. So that's kind of where, let's say, our understanding of what's possible in terms of cyber attacks and cyber war actually started. The second one, and I'm making a jump, there are much more in between, but I kind of had to focus on my main 3 cases that I look at. I look at many more in my research, but these are the ones I think most significant for today, is when Estonia decided in 2007 to remove the monument of the liberators of Tallinn. It's the bronze statue that was located in downtown Tallinn. And the Estonian government decided to relocate the statue. And what happened after that was the largest cyber attack that has been recorded in time since then on the Estonian government and the banking system. Probably or most likely by Russian hackers directly connected to the Russian government, but until today not called that way. It was a monument that was standing for the USSR defeat of Nazi Germany. It had a big, or still has today, a big significance for the Russian-speaking minority in Estonia. If you look at the analysis, why it happened and how it unfolded, it's very interesting. Very interesting case. It was the first real big demonstration of what Russian hackers are able to do. And it was also the first time that an international organization, NATO, realized that cyber is actually not just a funny little thing that they operate in, but it can actually be really threatened to NATO members and can potentially even be an act of war. So that was a very important case. The Estonian government had days and days where they really had to understand first what was happening, why their systems weren't working, and then had to solve that problem. Today, if you talk to Estonian officials, they're usually saying this was a great gift to us. We really made our systems very, very secure, very safe. I will talk about Estonia a little more throughout this talk every now and then, because I think it's an interesting case study to see how far we can go when it comes to public involvement in cybersecurity policy. So Estonia calls this a wake-up call, although at the time it was scary and threatening, but that was really the moment when Russia was back on the map, with other attacks at the same time happening in Georgia and around the world, but that was really the first time that Russia got back on the monitor when it came to what they can do in terms of cyber attacks. Then the last kind of case I want to talk about when we talk about cyber hype, and what kind of contributed to the idea of having a hype in cybersecurity was the latest, probably most significant attack, and on Ukraine in June 2017. Before I want to get started to get in that case a little more, I'm just curious. So, who of you has been personally affected by not Petya or Petya? So was your computer affected? Like, did you have to get anybody in? In that case, actually, you would have to remove your computer and completely get a new one. Anybody affected here by that? Okay. Anybody was affected by the WannaCry bug that kind of came along? Much more likely for people to get affected. Also not interesting, because I like to ask that question sometimes, because there's a very important difference with this attack in Ukraine with the so-called NotPetya malware that was employed there. So that was the first time that we have really seen a cyber attack through a malware really shutting down infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure being in peril in the United States or in other countries around the world, is mainly because we had this big incident of, we've been talking in the technology world for a while about infrastructure attacks and how possible they are, how we need to prepare for them, but this is really the first time that we have seen it in action. So let me tell you a little bit about Petya or not Petya. It's kind of like both names kind of go around in the internet about this specific attack, and it was based on, interestingly, two different factors and why it got so strong in its impact in Ukraine and beyond. The one was that allegedly Russian hackers used a former NSA hacking tool that was published just a couple months before this attack, called Eternal Blue, which is kind of an open, like a door in the Microsoft system that allowed this malware to enter, with another vulnerability in the Microsoft password system that was actually published a year before by a French researcher, and Petya kind of put both of these together and was very effective. So what did it do? Basically, it told the computer to destroy itself. To which extent, and I'm usually tailoring my talks to people that have a basic understanding of computers but are not computer experts, that particular malware encrypted the master boot record, which basically tells the computer how to function, but not only just encrypted it, it basically destroyed it. So there's no way, or there was no way and still no way to actually repair a computer that was affected by this. And that is important, and I will pick that up a little bit later. So what happened in Ukraine? There were, and just in Kiev alone, the capital of Ukraine, there were 4 hospitals shut down, 6 power companies were not able to work, 2 airports were shut down, more than 22 Ukrainian banks couldn't work, ATMs couldn't work, it didn't work in the card payment system, so you couldn't go buy anything for around 36 hours in Ukraine, at least when you wanted to pay with a credit card. In retailers, transports, pretty much every federal agency in Ukraine was affected. So it was huge, and it's the first time that we can really, as researchers, also look into very clear cases and on the cost of a cyber attack, which is always difficult to calculate, but Petya not Petya made it really possible for us to look into. The biggest, you might have heard that, if you haven't heard about this particular attack, was that the big Danish transport logistic company Maersk had to replace actually the entire infrastructure, which means the entire computer infrastructure in its entire company, because it was affected by this malware. So 45,000 PCs, 2,500 applications, and 4,000 servers. It took 10 days for them to do so. So there were actually ports in New Jersey that couldn't receive trucks coming in with containers. They couldn't manage any of the unloading and loading of ships. It was a very long, in the $200 million, if you think about it, that's actually not much, and then the estimates actually go much higher, that this company lost. So I asked you about WannaCry and NotPetya because they were very close, and WannaCry was really a classic ransomware attack. So your computer was shut down, you had to pay money, and then you would basically get your password. Well, let's say it differently. Anybody had ever his computer attacked by ransomware? Like you had to like put in a code, and then you had to get your data back. Okay, great. Well, I know a couple. I don't know if you know anybody now. I know a couple people that happened to. So it's fairly common. In general, WannaCry was very successful with that. So actually, I will show you in a second. So that is like the amount of computers, or not computers, but incidents, at least in the first 2 days of WannaCry, that were very much spread. Petya was very focused on Ukraine, actually back to Russia, because what Petya did, and that's interesting from military purposes, it really managed to stay in the network. So instead of spreading all over the world, like WannaCry did, on purpose, right, because they wanted to get as much ransom as they possibly could. NotPetya really was clearly designed as a cyber weapon. It was very much focused on Ukraine's system, very much focused on shutting down the Ukrainian infrastructure, and with the unintended consequences that always comes with pursuing a cyber attack, going back to systems that were similar or were run on similar programs, or have had the same vulnerability that it was designed to do. In this case, it was actually an accounting software where this ransomware was installed in. And if you had that accounting software, which was very widespread throughout Ukraine, you were very vulnerable. You were attacked by that. That also explains why there are actually attacks back to the Russian Federation, which is always a question if they calculated it in or not. It's almost impossible to calculate the effects of a cyber attack. But in this particular case, it was pretty astonishing how well designed it was for this particular network, for this particular geographical location. Okay, so why I'm talking about these is it is important that to note, and I'm not saying here there shouldn't be a hype about cyber attacks and there shouldn't be a hype about cyberspace. No, I do believe that we should have a heightened interest in it, and there is a development in cyber attacks and the change of how cyber attacks happen and how they can affect states and countries. I just don't think from research that we in political science do on security issues that a hype is very helpful. A hype does not help us really go to the root of the problem or mitigate this problem whatsoever. It actually makes it worse. Cyber attacks are real. We need to deal with them. We need to find better ways to make our systems safer, and we do. But if we talk about a broader response on how to deal with this from a state or government perspective, we really need to go actually to much more boring issues to solve how we can be prepared for cyber attacks. So in order to make that point here in the next 20 minutes or so, and I will make sure I get through this quick, I will make a case that there are actually concepts that we already know in political science, in international security studies, that we can apply to cyber, and we should. And I'm kind of constantly making that case. Cyber is not something completely out of the blue new that we don't know how to analyze. We can. We have instruments to do it. They're very helpful, and I think we should be doing it. There's a constant conversation about this, and I understand, and I have this debate on every conference, but it's still important to look back at actually what we already know about cyber, about security threats, and actually then help us understand what's going on in the cyber world. So to do this, I will talk briefly about the security dilemma that is actually that political scientists picked up from the Peloponnesian War and kind of worked through it in our studies. And then I will apply this to cyberspace. So how do we actually apply, or how is the security dilemma gets worse in cyberspace? And I will talk at the end a little bit how we can actually mitigate these risks of overreaction. So what can we do to actually not fall into that trap of thinking we cannot deal with cyber attacks or with cyberspace more generally? So the cybersecurity dilemma, really briefly put, basically means, and you all probably heard this before, and my students definitely did, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Right? That's we're all fairly familiar with this concept. So the war between Athens and Sparta, the idea was born that the states live and behave within an anarchic system. They all fight for themselves. We all do. And even if they don't want to conquer, they still have to fear what other states might do to them. So hence, states need to constantly prepare capabilities and collect intelligence to minimize this risk of misinterpreting what the other country or other state is doing, and to make sure that their own behavior might not actually threaten others and kind of start a war that was never wanted. And studying every war, there are always exactly these reactions to incidents that then spiral out of control. So I believe that when the state, or research has shown that when the state feels cornered, escalation, anxiety, even panic can quickly spiral out of control. And I think that is even more so the case when we look at cybersecurity or cyberspace. So the security dilemma in cyberspace is worse, or is because of three reasons mainly. We have counterintelligence failure, and I will talk about all these three in a little bit. Repeated intrusive intelligence collection, and the lack of international cooperation and norms. Those three make the cybersecurity dilemma worse in cyberspace. Because the more a state knows about their partners or adversaries, the more it feels empowered and safe. And in the good old days, that was just you send a spy and they take a bunch of pictures and then you actually understand what this other government is up to. Or you have already informants in the government and they tell you, oh yeah, we're planning this and that. And that was all, wiretapping, of course, photography of classified documents. All of these were pretty much classic spycraft. But today, all these, or many of our interactions are online. The realm of computer networks in which, cyberspace is being the realm of computer networks in which information is stored, shared, and communicated online. We're all in cyberspace all the time, so are our governments and their information. So spying today, of course, is done through computers. Spying is incredibly easy to do in cyberspace. You don't really have to, it's relatively cheap. You don't have to send anybody anywhere. You can just have them sit in their office. You can spy on multiple targets at the same time. You can basically spy 24/7. And the data you want is more often than not like an open door. I'm not saying that, of course, government networks are secured. Everybody's aware of that. But just the simple fact that that information is now easily accessible through online means makes securing networks almost impossible. So it's a little bit like the door. So if there's a network, there's a way to get the data eventually. So there's no way of having a network 100% safe from intruders, which keeps our military up at night, of course. So today everything is shared online, or stored online. And you can pretty much hire somebody who can just does the spying for you without actually ever entering the building. And that is the reason why collecting intelligence, especially when it comes to counterintelligence, is so much more complex in cyberspace and is so much more fearful for states to do. So when we look at counterintelligence failure, it pretty much means the fear of that this intelligence collection that usually mitigates the security dilemma, that you can collect as much information as you can, might fail simply because you might not get to the right information. Maybe you just don't see the right signal because there's so much data available, or your adversary is simply better at getting the intelligence than you are, and that's certainly the case often when we hear about these huge hacks into personal information or of government employees. Is that like what are they going to do with it? This is a huge amount of information that they got, and it's a big adding variable to their intelligence collection. So that means that the idea of the collection of intelligence and the fear that the adversary is better at getting at your information makes the security dilemma worse. You don't know if you're actually on top of your game. I would say there are kind of two examples that I will briefly discuss here that contributed to this security dilemma when it came to the US case anyway. The first is that the more we have the leak of information and the hacking tools of our national security agency, the more those tools and capabilities are public, the more it can be feared, of course, that those are used. And I showed that in our Petya non-Petya example. We can probably make the case that Russian hackers wouldn't have been that successful with that malware in Ukraine if they wouldn't have had the tools that the NSA developed and deployed for a long time. So these hacking and then also sharing of this material kind of creates the institutional fear of where we are at. Can we actually trust each other? Can we trust our information? How does that need to get stored? And I know that within those agencies, policy changed and who can access what after Snowden specifically, after he revealed that material. But it really, this kind of constant fear of being on top of the game really describes the current state of the NSA. And that contributes to this dilemma. So we don't know how much we can actually collect this intelligence. Or how good are we at it? The second one is, and I will come back to this point later, is a talent shortage. How much better are we at getting information? How much better are we at hacking? For years and years, decades, the US was always on top of the game. And I still would make the case that we still are. But it got a little bit more crowded on the top. For obvious reasons, because more and more countries realize the possibilities of what they can do with having more expertise in the tech sector, but also simply of the fact that other countries are using what they can do much more deliberately because they have less rules and regulations than the US has. So counterintelligence failure would be the one argument why the security dilemma is worse in cyberspace. The second one is that to actually have a successful cyber attack, and that's pretty much true for Petya well, a little bit less for Estonia absolutely as well, for the Estonian case, a little bit less for the Kosovo case, it's true that repeated intrusive intelligence collection is part of every cyber operation. It's part of the DNA. You have to know what the system is about before you can actually have a successful cyber attack. So Russian hackers had to be in the system in Ukraine, and they still are today, to figure out where can we place the malware most efficiently to not have it spread around the world, so not have everybody be affected, but to have really the country affected that we want the most. And they found this accounting software that all these institutions in Ukraine used, and found out that if they change the updates for the software, they can actually access mainly places in Ukraine and their own, but that they missed. They can't, calculate in everything. But spies are collecting intelligence in cyberspace all the time, 24/7. That's their job. That's not only their job in Russia, it's their job in the US, it's their job increasingly more in Europe as well, although there it's a little bit different. So collecting intelligence or being in a system and spying without being detected is part of the DNA of any cyber operations. So even if states have a defensive reason, which most of the time they do, it's just mainly the fact of, well, we want to collect more and more information, so in case of a war, we are prepared. But it's still defensive reasons. when they're within a state network, again, and I detected, it can easily be taken as an offensive gesture, or even an imminent attack, or escalate into conflict. So it's very quick from understanding, well, you're in our system. So one of the biggest jobs of a hacker from a government is, or from actually any institution, is not to get detected. And often that's even more important than the information you're collecting, because you're thinking long-term, right? So in the case of an attack, you want to be able to be right at the most important system administrator in the Kremlin, and you want to make sure you don't reveal that to anybody. So that kind of makes sense. We also have, and that's why I put the picture up here of the Iran nuclear deal final day of negotiations, or the official signature of the deal, was because we know, although the US has never really said it's true, there was always a contingency plan that was worked out. If the nuclear deal would fall through, and we know that from Edward Snowden's published material, is that there was a contingency plan from the US to shut down infrastructure in Iran. It's called Nitro-Zuis, but it was never used. It was preemptively developed in case the nuclear deal would not go through and Iran was posed an immediate threat to the region or to the United States. So a very good example of how this can be done, how can actually be sitting in a network be very beneficial for your own security, but you don't have to use what you actually are able to do. Another important piece here, you talked about repeated intrusive intelligence collection when it actually comes in sitting in a system to develop a cyber weapon. Intellectual property espionage falls into that category too. If you know how a warplane is built, how you know how the communication system works, you can all put these pieces together. Just in preparation for this talk, I was reading again about how NATO actually had this this exercise where they used information from around 150 soldiers and just the information that apparently Chinese hackers got on soldiers in the U.S. and they just pieced together what they could find online with the information they had, and they were able to really track down track records, maybe even private relationships that they didn't reveal, so kind of vulnerabilities in the soldiers' kind of life. And kind of really built this like social network picture, which obviously in a military context is much more dangerous. So if you look at intellectual property espionage or social media use, or if you use those social security numbers to connect it to people that are actually out and posting things on the internet, it can get very quick, really dangerous if you have all that information. That's part of that as well. But then it's also, and I'm not talking about this too much today, but we can in the discussion, is of course the same in hacking emails, right? And repeated intrusive intelligence collection also includes emails and information about an election. And so propaganda or the fake news I would also put under this category. So the third issue is kind of part of my core research. I'm kind of cutting this down quite a bit, so I'm not going off too much. Happy to answer questions later. Is that we generally have a lack of international cooperation on cybersecurity. We do have several instances where it works fairly well, and I will talk about this in a second. But states are pretty much too busy to spying on each other, and they think that the information they will get from other states through cooperation is not as valuable as the one that they can actually get from their own spying agencies. So states have always been reluctant to share intelligence. That's not new, of course, to cyber in any way. And if they fear to be attacked from every corner in the world all the time, why should they actually share any? Especially when it comes to really strong cyber powers like the US. There's really not much incentive for them to share or cooperate. I will have a couple exceptions in a second. But on the other hand, international cooperation makes actually a whole lot more sense in cyberspace because we have no borders in cyberspace, right? Non-state actors are active, and there's a big range of attacks on personal data that I just discussed can be actually also very relevant when it comes when they're used for military purposes. And a safer national cyberspace can really only be obtained in a logical world with an international exchange of information about attacks, malicious codes, global encryption, stuff like that. So we've seen that before during the Cold War, right? Nuclear proliferation was really only effectively mitigated with international cooperation and kind of diminished the security dilemma to at the time, and I will make the case that it's actually the same would be true for cyberspace. So why don't we have a common code for conduct for cyberspace? So far, we have a lot of different ideas about how that should work, and that has a lot to do with how we see information and freedom of information. Obviously, China and Russia have a very different idea of that than the US and Europe. We have very challenging interinstitutional coordination. I mean, cybersecurity in the US is already very complex to understand who is doing what anyway, so it's hard to coordinate within your country. So how would you actually be able to then effectively cooperate with others? There is a limited human and financial resources, although we have made big strides to the financial part, at least in the US. Other countries are still catching up. But the human resource is a big challenge, and I will talk about this in my conclusions again a little bit. And obviously, the fear of losing your competitive edge. You know, the US wants to stay on top, and obviously nobody else wants to reveal any of their capabilities, so why should they then talk to each other? In my research, I've found that the more cyber power a state has, less likely it is to actually engage in international cooperation. So when we look at when actually international cooperation happens in cyberspace, it's mainly between countries that have mid-level or low-level cyber powers, and I have a whole paper on how I define that, and I can talk about it later. If it's actually adjunct, this cooperation on cyber, if it's adjunct to a solid institutional framework, so if we already have an international organization that we can use to work on these issues, with all the problems that the international organization brings, and actually really on issues with a small risk of losing capability edge. So we won't be, having maybe much conversation on how to best hack into the Kremlin necessarily, but there are other opportunities to share information that does maybe not impede this competitive edge that states have. So we see a bunch of different bilateral agreements on cybersecurity between countries. Very interesting to look at a couple that are actually multilateral. So we all hopefully still know about the 5 Eyes, so the countries, Canada, UK, New Zealand, US, and Australia, who already have intelligence sharing on non-cyber issues, and they kind of extended that on cyber as well. Very powerful cyber powers here that are exchanging intelligence and have a much higher level, we can assume, or what we know from the Snowden material, a much higher level of exchanging intelligence information in terms of cyber. Then we have the UN, and some of my students here can tell you a little bit about that, because they worked on the UN last year in New York on actually negotiating cybersecurity there, is that in the UN, these competitive cyber powers, especially when it comes to China, Russia, and the US, all kind of trying to work out a common code of conduct, but it's extremely challenging. The moment you have a very competitive cyber power at the table with countries that are not as sophisticated in their capabilities, it's a very long process and not very effective to actually come up with a common code of conduct. So we don't have one in the UN so far. The area where we find the most extensive cybersecurity cooperation is within NATO and within the European Union on the European continent. And again, there's a whole paper on this, but mainly because we don't really have a lot of strong cyber powers in Europe. They're slowly developing. I call them even mid-level countries. They have the capabilities, they have the possibilities to expand their capabilities fairly quickly, but they're not quite there yet. However, they do it together within NATO and also within the European Union. However, most progress when it comes to cybersecurity cooperation is within cybercrime. So there we can actually really see a lot of broad cooperation with the US and even China sometimes, and even Russia to a certain extent. So cybercrime, everybody agrees on, should be defeated. So okay, so let me just. Okay, so the challenge of really having international cooperation mitigate the security dilemma in cyberspace is fairly limited. So we don't really have a good chance of actually stopping the spiral of security fear with international cooperation quite yet. But we're not completely lost. and that is important, and I will talk about this in my conclusions, is that we do have the opportunity of, we do have the opportunity of actually fostering international cooperation. So let me just summarize real quick what I've talked about in the last couple minutes. So the security dilemma, I believe, is an important concept. It's good to use a concept that we already have in security studies to apply it to cyberspace. That's true for any other political science concept that we know about. So it's not, don't be afraid, my students here, to look at cyberspace and cybersecurity with applying basically what you learned in your intro to international relations. You can apply it to cyberspace, and you should. I think we can actually learn a lot, and there's a big gap in the literature on that we're slowly closing, but still a lot of work to be done. So I think it's important to understand state behavior in cyberspace. But I also call for political scientists to actually look at cyberspace. We need to look at cyberspace to understand the global power play of powers. We cannot only look at what we can see in front of us, and our traditional ways of looking at wars doesn't work anymore. We need to look, when we look at political scientists that studies, look at states and how they interact and where we have power plays going on. It is in cyber, and it will be more in cyber than we've used to do it. So I think we need to look at cyber. So it's kind of a call for everybody that works on these issues to actually look at the cyberspace, and don't be discouraged of it. It's not as complicated as we all think. Counterintelligence favor, repeated intrusive intelligence collection, lack of international cooperation make the security dilemma worse in cyberspace. And we need to be aware of this, of those kind of vulnerabilities that we have in our own doing and what cyberspace brings to us. And the more cyber power a state has, the less likely it is to engage in international cooperation. However, if it's a mid-level cyber power, and then we have a solid institutional framework, like, for example, the European Union or NATO, we actually have a good chance of mitigating that, at least when we look at mid-level cyber powers. However, I do think we still have to look at, for example, cases of the nuclear proliferation case, where we were very successful to actually exchange information where it could profit anybody. It makes us much safer. And that brings me to my last slide, and how to mitigate the risk of our own overreaction. Or if we say of our own, we can also just say of our government's overreaction. And I have two main proposals that I'm making over and over again. Happy to make them again. The first, we have a kind of more like a boring kind of mitigation. It's kind of like it's us, right? We need to be better at mitigating those issues. And it's not only us on the personal level. They're great, how to make my computer system more safe guides on various news outlets. But what I'm talking about is really training cyber personnel. And I'm not only talking about those cyber nerds that take my security classes in Arizona, but also those that, just us. For example, I talked about Estonia. Estonia came up with this idea of spreading its cyber defense far and wide. Have civilians, amateurs, voluntary, like amateurs, high school teachers, academics, everybody works in this voluntary cyber reserve that becomes active if an attack lasts more than 1 or 2 days. So if it's a more severe attack like the ones they experienced in 2004, and then at least recently again a similar one in 2013, they can sign up to be part of this voluntarily cyber reserve. So the government pays for the permanent staff, everybody else is voluntary, and if there's no attack happening and you don't know anything about cyber, you can still be part of it. You can take classes for free, it's all an online community, you can educate yourself, and then you get into different levels of attacks, but it's basically a government coordinated attack, broad reserve to respond to a cyber attack, which I think makes a lot of sense. 1.7% of the population in Estonia is part of this. Estonian population is not very big, so I don't expect that to be happening anytime soon here. However, I still think it's a good idea to kind of spread the net a little wider, and you can train cyber personnel out of that. You can have a broader base of people that maybe get more interested in doing more after that. I also think it's more than time to have cybersecurity, not only cybersecurity, but cyber classes on all levels of our education system. That's not only true for the university, which I think has a very big responsibility here, but also even middle school and high schools. And I'm not talking programming. I'm talking about general code of conduct and internet. What can you do with sharing your information? What do you do? What can happen with actually using your information, and how can it be used and misused for it? But also kind of going on from there, sparking an interest in these issues early on. And not only, again, in this like technical programming world, but kind of really general awareness of this is kind of an area where we have to be aware of. So basically, and obviously I'm a defender of liberal arts, I'm from that area, but we need to connect that more, and we can have to have more attention paid to what happens to us and our behavior in the cyber world. The second one is to focus on international cooperation. I was very excited to see that actually in fall 2018 Cyber Command, US Cyber Command here actually decided to put into work this consistent engagement policy. There were a couple changes within the US security policy that made that possible, but really the idea of cooperating with specific, very vulnerable countries. In this case it was Montenegro, Macedonia, and Ukraine, where they sent troops to actually support their network defenses, and at the same time the US received samples of malware they were not aware of. So they could actually use that and add it to their own collection of malware that they're already collecting, and be prepared for that. For those instances of possible attack. So building international trust also means, though, sharing zero-day exploits, which means those vulnerabilities in the Microsoft system that the NSA like to keep under, if they know about it, like to exploit themselves. But also supporting a strong global encryption system, which is always a constant discussion, and I'm happy to discuss this here. But I think there are a lot of ways of mitigating this risk. And I would like to end my talk with a call, another call for all of us to not only become public interest technologists, because that's kind of the new buzzword for everybody who works in technology, to be more aware of the public interest in their work and actually advocate for that, but actually to be a technological interested public, right? So we need, that doesn't get scared away by the dark, qualities of the internet, but that gets kind of informed by the risks and manage it. And I think that's a great way of going forward. So thank you so much for this talk and for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And I have no idea what time. Yeah, let me just see what time. Do you know what time it is? Oh, God, okay. Great. Please.
So really quick, you mentioned that the data collection in Europe is a little bit different than it is elsewhere. How so?
Well, because we have a different regulatory system. For example, today, the European Commission fined Google for, I think, for the fifth time in like 5 years for like antitrust fraud in Europe. So they're much more towards a watchdog what the big tech companies are doing, but also what happens to your own information. So you're much more likely to get your information deleted. You have the right of being forgotten on Google, so you can delete your you can have Google delete your records if you want so you can appeal them. There's a right to be forgotten. That's the biggest example always, but there's a different understanding, right? We come into the conversation about freedom of speech, and that the idea of that is interpreted much differently here than it is in Europe.
So we don't have those rights to get our information deleted.
Well, no. So you can, for example, if you have a copyright issue, you can, for example, if your picture gets used and you don't want the picture to get used, you can file copyright violations on YouTube. You can file 3, and then they repeatedly use that information, or your pictures, for example, they have to take it down. But we are in that process still, and we are very much in the infancy. But we can see that now. Yet the more information gets misused, the more aware of it. But I encourage everybody to look, where is your information used, where is your pictures are used, and are they used in the context that you would like them or not? And if not, then you take responsibility. The moment you put up your picture, you take responsibility of kind of looking what actually happens to them. I think that's important, but it's a different idea in Europe. I think the idea of privacy is much more expanded there than it is over here, at least in some areas. Yeah. Kenyon?
Could you elaborate more on the need to share zero-day exploits? Does that mean like a more robust private-public partnership where they share
No, it actually has nothing to do with public-private partnership. It's really the idea of having these like basic vulnerabilities in computer systems. So when you have one, for example, in Microsoft, and that was Microsoft was so upset, or Apple the same way, that the NSA wouldn't share those vulnerabilities with them, and then this new material was released, and they learned about it. They kind of want to know when there's a weakness, and they want to fix it, right? So if you would maybe write Microsoft, they would like the NSA to do the same thing. So what I mean is that if you share that information instead of using it for your own intelligence purposes, other countries have the chance to patch that up. So in the Petya non-Petya case, well, if maybe Ukraine would have been faster in actually seeing the published hacking tool, the vulnerabilities that was published, and applying it to the system, they probably wouldn't have had a problem, but they just weren't fast enough. So there would have been already an established way of communication like they do today. They probably would have been faster to react to that. And that's so those 3 countries that were picked were not picked out of the randomness. They were picked because they are very vulnerable. And the U.S. wants them to help to make their network safer. Yes.
So with businesses moving more and more toward the cloud-based computing and all information is stored in the cloud, how at risk is that going to be versus having something stored in a vault where it used to be for information or even products?
Well, the same. If you think about, you're talking about it used to be on a computer, maybe in a server that you could actually see, but that really doesn't. It's not a difference. The network is a network. So as long as you have it connected to a network, and often that can actually be even bridged, depending if you have wireless capabilities or such, there's not a big difference. There is, however, you can have a cyber insurance for that case. You as a company, you can use insurance if you get hacked and your information gets stolen. But for example, in the Petya case, that insurance didn't pay out because it was an act of war, because it was identified as such, and so insurances wouldn't pay for it. So there's still a big gap. But if you have a normal attack on your company, like let's say ransomware, you get an insurance. I don't think every responsible company should have that. Because it's just how we will be operating. It's same as like having house insurance or travel insurance. It should be part of your insurance portfolio. And a lot of companies offer that. However, the same with our normal insurances with the okay, well, it's an act of war, we don't. But in cyber, it's a little bit harder to determine. And I feel like insurance can probably make the case pretty quickly that it's a cyber war attack and not necessarily just a cyber crime. Long answer to a very important question, though. So. Not more safe one way or the other.
And that is our time for today. Thank you so much, Eva, for sharing with us and answering questions, and we're just so happy you could join us. We hope everyone will be able to join us for our next talk in this series on safety and security in the modern world, which will be looking at Yemen's spiraling humanitarian disaster on April 10th. We have slides and information just on the table right outside, and if you are not currently getting our emails with announcements about future events, please do sign up before you leave. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.